What if the most feared crime boss in the entire city spent 20 years trapped in a wheelchair, told by every world-class doctor that he'd never walk again? And then one broke. Desperate single mom with nothing left to lose proved every single one of them wrong. It didn't take $1 million surgeon to break his curse. It took a pair of healing hands, a secret worth killing for, and a mother who would do absolutely anything for her son. Let me tell you how it happened. Everything changed for the Moretti family in one single night. Adrian Moretti was just 22 years old, fresh out of a private university and completely unprepared to inherit a criminal empire, when a rival crew planted a car bomb outside his father's favorite steakhouse. The blast killed the elder Moretti instantly. Adrian, walking just 3 steps behind him, was hurled backward through the plate glass window of the storefront next door. Shrapnel and shattered glass tore through his back, ripping muscle and pulverizing one of his lower vertebrae. He woke up 3 weeks later in a sterile, off-the-books hospital room, and the doctors, men whose enormous salaries were paid in untraceable cash, delivered the verdict with shaking voices. Adrian would live, he would rule, but he would never walk again. Over the next 20 years, Adrian built an entire empire from a seated position. He took his father's chaotic street operations and transformed them into a streamlined, almost corporate syndicate that controlled the port shipping lanes and half the unions in the region. He became a ghost, a mythic figure operating out of a heavily fortified estate up north on the lakeshore. Feared, respected, and deeply, unimaginably alone. His fortune bought him the finest medical minds on the planet. Neurologists from Switzerland, experimental surgeons from Japan, holistic gurus from the West Coast. They all made the pilgrimage to his guarded compound. They took his money, ran their procedures, prescribed their narcotics, and every single one of them failed. The lower half of his body stayed a dead zone, a constant reminder of the day his old life ended and his reign began. By his 40th birthday, Adrian had fired them all and accepted his paralysis as a permanent, immovable fact. 30 miles away, in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a gritty part of town, a woman named Nadia Ford was fighting a very different war. Nadia was 32, running on 4 hours of sleep and the bitter dregs of cheap coffee. Her kitchen table was buried under a mountain of medical bills, eviction warnings, and final notices. Her 8-year-old son, Leo, was asleep in the next room, a quiet hum coming from the expensive air filtration machine beside his bed. Leo had a severe degenerative respiratory condition. The medications kept him breathing, but they were bankrupting Nadia faster than she could earn. She was a licensed physical therapist. But a brutal divorce and a vindictive ex had wrecked her credit and forced her into off-the-books work just to survive. She worked at a dingy, dimly lit wellness center downtown, taking cash under the table to rehab construction workers, athletes who couldn't afford real insurance, and the occasional bruised enforcer who needed his broken muscles put back in working order. And here's the thing about Nadia. She had a gift. She didn't just understand anatomy, she felt it. Where doctors saw X-rays and MRI scans, Nadia felt the tension, the blocked flow, the microscopic adhesions in the tissue that trapped nerves and choked off blood. In her small, desperate circle, she was known as the woman with the hands of life. It was a rainy Tuesday night when a man named Gabriel Vance walked into her clinic. Gabriel was Adrian Moretti's right-hand man, a towering, quiet enforcer in a tailored suit that barely hid the bulk of his shoulder holster. He didn't make an appointment. He simply locked the front door, flipped the sign to closed, and walked into the back room where Nadia was washing her hands. "Nadia Ford," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Nadia froze, water dripping from her fingers into the sink. She took in the expensive clothes, the scarred jaw, the cold professional deadness in his eyes. "We're closed. You need to leave." "I have an employer," Gabriel went on, ignoring her. "He suffers from chronic, untreatable pain and paralysis. The doctors have given up. He needs alternative management. We've been watching you. You fixed a man named Takami after his motorcycle accident, when the state hospital wanted to amputate his arm. I don't know who you're talking about, Nadia lied, reaching for a towel, her heart hammering. Gabriel reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick, banded stack of $100 bills. He dropped it on the massage table with a heavy, definitive thud. $10,000 for one session. If you provide relief, it becomes a weekly arrangement. If you ask questions about who he is, where you are, or what we do, you will never see your son again. Nadia's breath caught at the mention of Leo. She looked at the money. $10,000 was 4 months of Leo's medication. It was rent. It was survival. She looked back at Gabriel, maternal desperation overriding common sense. I need my specialized oils and my tools. Bring them, Gabriel said, gesturing to the door. There's a car waiting, and a blindfold. The ride felt like an eternity. Sitting in the back of a black SUV with silk tied tight over her eyes, Nadia ran through the anatomy of the spine in her head just to keep from panicking, mapping the sciatic nerve, the lumbar plexus, the whole intricate web of muscle that supports the lower back. When the blindfold finally came off, she was standing in the middle of a palatial, mahogany-paneled bedroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the dark, churning waters of the lake. The room smelled of expensive cologne, old paper, and a faint, acrid hint of antiseptic. And in the center, near a roaring fireplace, sat a man in a matte black titanium wheelchair. Adrian Moretti was striking, a sharp, aristocratic face framed by dark hair lightly touched with silver at the temples. He wore a crisp dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle from 2 decades of pushing his own weight. But it was his eyes that pinned Nadia in place. Piercing, intelligent, colder than the lake outside his window. Another miracle worker, Gabriel, Adrian said, his voice smooth and dripping with exhausted sarcasm. He didn't even look at her, just stared into the fire, a crystal glass of amber liquid resting on his thigh. I thought I told you I was done with these charlatans. She's not a doctor, boss, Gabriel said quietly from the doorway. She's a mechanic for the human body. Just give her an hour. Adrian finally turned his head, his gaze sweeping over Nadia. The cheap, worn scrubs, the practical sneakers, the tightly braided hair. You look like a high school nurse. What exactly is your methodology, Miss Ford? Crystals? Are you going to rub lavender oil on my dead legs and tell me my chakras are blocked? Nadia swallowed hard and forced her spine straight. The fear was there, but the professional in her, the woman who'd survived a brutal life by being exceptionally good at her job, took over. I charge by the hour, sir, she said, her voice steady. Whether you spend it throwing a tantrum or letting me do my job is entirely up to you. Gabriel stiffened by the door. Nobody spoke to Adrian Moretti like that. Nobody. A heavy, dangerous silence stretched across the room, the crackle of the fire sounding like gunshots. And slowly, the corner of Adrian's mouth twitched up into a humorless smile. Bold, I'll give you that. Gabriel waited outside. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving Nadia alone with the most dangerous man in the city. Get on the table, she instructed, pointing to the padded medical table set up by the windows. Adrian maneuvered his chair with fluid, practiced precision, then hoisted himself out of it with a powerful surge of his upper body, landing face down on the table. Do your worst, Miss Ford. Though I assure you, I can't feel a thing. Nadia rolled up her sleeves and placed her hands on his lower back. The moment her skin touched his, she understood the problem. The surgical scars were extensive, jagged railroad tracks cutting across his lumbar spine. But the real issue wasn't the bone, it was the tissue. Over 20 years, his body had laid down thick, concrete-like layers of scar tissue and fascia to protect the trauma site. That dense, fibrous webbing had basically strangled the surrounding nerve roots. The previous surgeons had focused entirely on the spinal cord itself, terrified of causing more damage, treating him like fragile glass. They'd completely ignored the suffocating cage of muscle and connective tissue wrapped around the injury. You've been protecting this area for 2 decades, Nadia murmured, her thumbs tracing the rigid edges of the scar tissue. It's paralyzed, There's nothing to protect, Adrian muttered into the face cradle. Your brain doesn't know that, she replied. Your nervous system is stuck in a permanent trauma response. It built a wall. I need to break it down. And it's going to hurt. I don't feel pain down there. That's the definition of paralysis. Nadia drove her elbow directly into the thickest knot of scar tissue just above his left hip, hitting it with a sudden immense amount of concentrated pressure. Adrian gasped. His massive shoulders tensed, his hands gripping the edges of the table so hard the leather groaned. A sharp, electric jolt, something he hadn't felt in exactly 20 years and 4 months, shot down the back of his left thigh. It wasn't a dull ache. It was a blinding, fiery spike of real, localized pain. What the hell did you just do? He ground out, his voice shaking. I found a nerve that isn't dead, Nadia said, her own heart racing as she held the brutal pressure. It's just buried alive. Breathe, Mr. Moretti. For the next hour, she went to work. No gentle spa strokes, but deep myofascial release, tearing apart the microscopic adhesions with her thumbs, knuckles, and elbows. Grueling physical labor, sweat beaded on her forehead, and Adrian lay there with a war raging inside his body. A man who had tortured enemies without blinking, who'd taken a bullet and survived. But this awakening of a dead zone was a terrifying vulnerability. He felt phantom fires, deep aching throbs, bizarre tingling rushes of cold running down his legs, and then, as Nadia dug into a trigger point near his lowest vertebra, the impossible happened. Down at the end of the table, Adrian's left foot, pale, atrophied, motionless for 2 decades, twitched. The big toe flexed downward just a fraction of an inch before going still. Nadia stopped. She pulled her hands back, her breath catching. Adrian slowly pushed himself up on his elbows and turned to look back at his foot, then up at her. His face was pale, his dark eyes wide with a frantic, dangerous energy. The carefully crafted armor of the stoic boss had completely fractured. Did that move? His voice cracked. Yes, she whispered. He stared at her. The silence was deafening, and when he finally spoke, it was a lethal, quiet whisper. If you're giving me false hope, Nadia Ford, if this is some trick of the nerves, I will have Gabriel drop you in the lake. She met his gaze without flinching. It's not a trick. Your spinal cord isn't completely severed. It's severely compressed. I can't promise you'll run marathons, Mr. Moretti. But if you let me do my job, I think I can get you back on your feet. 6 weeks passed, and Nadia's life fell into a bizarre double rhythm. By day, she was the exhausted mom making Leo's oatmeal, measuring his medication, fending off eviction notices with the thick envelopes of cash Gabriel handed her twice a week. By night, she was the keeper of Adrian Moretti's most dangerous secret. The sessions were brutal. Adrian was a demanding, relentless patient, driven by a new, almost maniacal hope. He pushed himself past every human limit, and under her therapy, the microscopic tears in his fascia healed and lengthened. The trapped nerve roots began to fire. It started with twitches, then a dull ache in his calves. By week 4, he could voluntarily flex his left thigh. And by week 6, standing between the parallel bars Nadia had Gabriel install in a private gym, Adrian held his own weight for a full 12 seconds before collapsing into Gabriel's arms. The change in him was seismic. The bitter, cynical ghost who used to stare out the window was gone, replaced by a predator waking from a long hibernation. His mind was sharper, his orders more decisive, but that sudden shift did not go unnoticed by the city's criminal ecosystem. Across town, a man named Silas Kane sat in the back room of a legitimate-looking import-export business, chewing a cheap cigar and listening to his informants. Kane was a brutal, opportunistic man who'd spent the last decade slowly chipping away at the edges of the Moretti empire, waiting for Adrian to finally give in to his weakness. He's changing, a nervous lieutenant reported. Moretti's moving product faster. He rejected the truce on the docks. And Gabriel Vance is playing bodyguard for some civilian woman, picking her up in a blindfold twice a week. Kane's eyes narrowed. A woman. Moretti hasn't had a woman in that compound since the chair. What is she, We don't think so, the lieutenant said. She's a physical therapist, works out of a dump downtown. Kane smiled, a flash of gold in the dim light. In their world, any change in routine was a vulnerability. If Moretti was seeking therapy, maybe his condition was getting worse, or maybe this woman meant something to him. Either way, she was a lever. Find out where she lives, pick her up, let's see what kind of secrets she's massaging out of him. It was a Thursday evening. Nadia had just picked up Leo's specialty medication from the pharmacy, the sun setting and casting long, bloody shadows across the cracked pavement of her neighborhood. She was carrying a grocery bag in one hand, her keys in the other, mentally doing the math on whether she could afford a better apartment next month. She never heard the footsteps behind her. A heavy hand clamped over her mouth, an arm wrapped around her waist, and she was dragged backward into the narrow, garbage-strewn alley between two buildings. She thrashed, her groceries scattering, the expensive pill bottles rattling into the gutter. "Keep quiet, sweetheart," a rough voice hissed in her ear. She was slammed against the brick, the air driven from her lungs. 3 men surrounded her, faces lost in shadow, but she could see the cold gleam of a switchblade in the hand of the one pinning her. "You've been spending a lot of time up on the lake shore," he said, pressing the flat of the blade to her cheek. "Silas Kane wants to know what you're doing with Adrian Moretti. Is he dying? Is he finally circling the drain?" Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm. "I don't know who that is. I'm just a masseuse." The man laughed, an ugly sound. "Don't lie to us, Nadia. We know about the apartment. We know about the sick little boy, Leo. Be a real shame if something happened to his breathing machine while you were at work." Pure terror spiked through her veins. They knew about Leo. The threat to her own life was one thing. The threat to her son shattered every defense she had. And before she could speak, the screech of tires echoed at the mouth of the alley. A massive black SUV had jumped the curb, its headlights blindingly bright, trapping the 3 men in a stark white glare. The doors flew open, and Gabriel Vance stepped out, silhouetted against the light. He didn't speak. He didn't issue a warning. He simply raised a suppressed handgun and fired twice. 2 of the men dropped to the pavement, their knees shattered. The one holding Nadia froze, eyes wide with panic, shoved her forward as a human shield, and sprinted off into the dark. Nadia stumbled to the ground, scraping her hands and knees, hyperventilating, staring at the men writhing on the asphalt. Gabriel holstered his weapon, walked over, and hauled her gently to her feet. "Gabriel?" she choked out, tears spilling over. "They knew about Leo. They know my son." Gabriel's expression was grim. He pulled a burner phone from his pocket, hit a single button, and pressed it to his ear. "Boss, Kane's men tried to grab her. They threatened the boy." He listened for a moment, and Nadia saw his posture straighten. "Understood," he said, hanging up. He looked down at her. "We're going to your apartment. You have 10 minutes to pack a bag for you and your son. Leave everything else." "What? No, I can't." "Kane crossed a line," Gabriel interrupted, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Adrian's ordered a full lockdown. As of tonight, the truce is over. If you and your son stay here, you'll be dead by morning." Within the hour, Nadia and a sleepy, terrified Leo were in the back of the SUV, speeding north. And when they finally passed through the towering iron gates of the Moretti estate, the reality of her situation settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She was guided inside, armed guards at every entrance, and led to the massive library on the first floor. Adrian was waiting, and he wasn't in his wheelchair. He was seated on a heavy leather sofa, gripping a silver-tipped cane with white-knuckled intensity. When Nadia entered, holding Leo tight to her side, Adrian looked up. His eyes were no longer cold. They were blazing with a terrifying protective fury. He took in the bruises forming on her arms, the dirt on her clothes, the trembling boy hiding behind her legs. "They touched you," he said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "They threatened my son, Mr. Moretti," Nadia said, her voice shaking. I just wanted to do my job. I didn't sign up for a war. And then, slowly, agonizingly, Adrian pushed himself up from the sofa. His legs trembled, the newly awakened muscles screaming in protest. But he stood. He leaned heavily on the cane, towering over the room. It was the first time Nadia had ever seen him stand outside the parallel bars. "You aren't just an employee anymore, Nadia," he said, taking a slow, uneven step toward her. "You're the woman who gave me my life back. Silas Kane thinks he found my weakness." He stopped a few feet away, his intense gaze locking onto hers, the air between them crackling. "I'm going to show him," he promised softly, "that he actually found my strength. You and Leo will live here, under my roof, under my protection. And God help the man who tries to take you from me." The estate was less a home than a gilded fortress. For the first few days, Nadia felt like a ghost drifting through its cavernous marble halls. She'd traded the constant gnawing anxiety of poverty for the suffocating, high-stakes tension of the criminal underworld. And yet, for all the armed men patrolling with rifles slung over their tailored suits, the place offered something she hadn't had in years. Absolute, uncompromising security. Adrian didn't do anything by half. The morning after their escape, Nadia woke in a guest suite bigger than her whole old apartment to find 3 of the top pediatric pulmonologists in the region waiting downstairs. They'd been flown in by private helicopter, paid enormous consulting fees, and ordered to evaluate 8-year-old Leo. Within 48 hours, an entire wing of the mansion was retrofitted with hospital-grade filtration systems. Leo's new bedroom looked like a spaceship, complete with an oxygen-enriched environmental control unit humming with a quiet, steady rhythm. And for the first time since he was a toddler, Leo slept through the night without a single coughing fit. Nadia wept in the hallway when the lead specialist handed her a completely revised, state-of-the-art treatment plan. "I don't know how to repay him," she whispered to Gabriel, standing watch at the end of the corridor like a stone gargoyle. "You already are," Gabriel replied softly, his eyes flicking toward the grand staircase. "Just keep doing your job. He's waiting for you." The dynamic between them had fundamentally shifted. The sterile, transactional feel of those early sessions was gone, replaced by an intense, almost volatile intimacy. Every evening, behind the locked doors of the private gym, they waged war on his atrophied muscles. Adrian was a man possessed. The taste of mobility, the agonizing, thrilling sensation of his feet bearing weight, had woken a ferocious drive in him. But recovery wasn't a movie montage. It was brutal, ugly, and excruciating. "Again," Adrian grunted, knuckles white on the parallel bars, sweat soaking through his gray shirt, his legs trembling and locked at the knees. "Adrian, you've been at this for 2 hours," Nadia cautioned, standing close behind him, hands hovering near his hips. She'd dropped the formal Mr. Moretti, somewhere around the 3rd week, realizing he hated the pretense when he was vulnerable. "Your nervous system is overloading. You need to rest the fascia." "I said again," he snapped. He forced his right leg forward, but the newly reconnected pathways misfired, his knee buckled, and he collapsed backward. Nadia caught him, her arms wrapping around his solid torso, taking his full weight, the momentum carrying them both down onto the padded mat with Adrian landing heavily against her chest. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was their ragged, synchronized breathing. He was practically on top of her, his face inches from her neck. She could feel the frantic thud of his heart against her ribs. "I hate this," Adrian whispered, the anger draining out of him, leaving only hollow exhaustion. "I hate being weak. Kane is burning my warehouses, and I'm lying on a gym floor like a helpless child." Nadia didn't push him away. Instinctively, one hand moved to the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, a soothing pressure at the base of his skull. "You aren't weak, Adrian. You survived a bomb. You built an empire from a chair, and now you're rebuilding your own nervous system through sheer force of will. Kane has no idea what's coming for him." Adrian slowly lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. The closeness was electric. For 20 years he had forbidden anyone from touching him with anything but clinical detachment. His paralysis had built a wall around his body and his soul. And Nadia had dismantled it, layer by layer, muscle by muscle. He looked at her mouth, then back up to her eyes, and slowly brought a large hand up to cup the side of her face. His thumb brushed over the fading bruise on her cheekbone, the lingering mark from Cain's men. "They will never touch you again," he vowed, his voice a dark velvet promise. "I will burn this city to the bedrock before I let anyone hurt you or the boy." But before Nadia could respond, a heavy knock echoed on the gym door. Gabriel's voice came through the thick wood. "Boss, we have a problem. It's Vincent." Adrian closed his eyes, a mask of cold fury instantly replacing the vulnerable man of a second ago. He rolled off her, grabbed the heavy cane by the mats, and with a massive heave, pulled himself up to standing. "Help me to the chair," he ordered, his tone all business now. "No one outside this room knows I can stand. And right now, that's the greatest weapon I have." The war in the streets was escalating, but the real danger was brewing inside the family. Vincent Moretti was Adrian's cousin, a slick, ambitious underboss who ran the family's underground casino operations. For years, Vincent had played the loyal subordinate, kissing the ring, bowing to the man in the chair. But he despised that a cripple ruled the syndicate. He thought it made the family look weak, a sentiment Silas Cain was expertly exploiting. Adrian sat in his titanium wheelchair at the head of the massive boardroom table in the library, Gabriel a silent sentinel by the window, as Vincent paced the Persian rug waving a lit cigar. "We're bleeding, Adrian," Vincent shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "Cain hit the shipping containers at the pier last night. 3 million in untraceable electronics gone. We look like fools. And you're locked up in this compound with some civilian woman and her sick kid, playing house while Rome burns." Adrian's expression stayed carved from granite, his hands resting relaxed on the armrests. "Are you questioning my leadership, Vincent?" "I'm stating facts," Vincent shot back, face flushed. "The captains are nervous. Cain knows our patrol routes. He knows the gate codes to the south side depots. We have a leak, and the only thing that's changed lately is her, the nurse, Nadia." Gabriel's hand drifted subtly toward his jacket, but Adrian raised a single finger, stopping him. "Nadia Ford has no access to our logistics," he said, far too softly. "She doesn't know a shipping route from a grocery list. You're grasping at straws to hide the fact that your casinos are down 20% this quarter. It's a distraction." Vincent pressed, jabbing a finger. "You need to hand her over to Cain. He wants to know why you're hiding her. It's a peace offering. Give the woman to Cain and we sit down and negotiate a ceasefire." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Adrian slowly leaned forward, the muscles in his newly rehabilitated legs twitching, begging to snap straight, begging to let him stand and strangle his cousin with his bare hands. But he held it in. He needed Vincent to play his hand completely. "You want me to hand over an innocent woman and a child to Silas Cain to negotiate?" His voice was venomous. "Get out of my sight, Vincent, before I decide to reorganize the family tree." Vincent sneered, flicking his cigar into the fireplace. "You're weak, Adrian. The chair finally rotted your brain." He stormed out, the heavy door slamming behind him. Adrian sat in silence a long time, then looked at Gabriel. "He's the mole." Gabriel nodded grimly. Cain hitting the pier containers was an inside job. Only 3 people had that logistics manifest. You, me, and Vincent. Do you want me to handle him? "No," Adrian said, his eyes glittering with a dark, calculating light. "Vincent's going to make a move. He thinks I'm a sitting duck, totally dependent on this chair and your guns. He's going to invite Cain's vipers right into the nest. Boss, if they breach the estate, Nadia and Leo are in the crossfire. Move them to the panic room in the basement tomorrow night," Adrian ordered. "Give Leo his games. Tell Nadia it's a security drill. And Gabriel, make sure my cane is polished." The trap was set. But even the best-laid plans can't account for human emotion. That night, unable to sleep, Nadia wandered down to the kitchen for a glass of water. The mansion was eerily quiet, the storm outside battering the windows with sheets of rain. She found Adrian in the darkened conservatory, sitting in his wheelchair, staring out at the lightning tearing across the surface of the lake. "You shouldn't be wandering the halls," he said without turning. "I couldn't sleep," she said, stepping in, wearing a simple silk robe over her pajamas, hair falling loose over her shoulders. She walked over and stood beside him. "The tension in this house, it's like a tightly wound spring. Something's going to happen, isn't it?" Adrian finally looked at her. In the flashes of lightning, his face was a portrait of beautiful, tragic exhaustion. "This is the life I tried to keep you out of when I brought you here. I'm a monster, Nadia. I command violent men who do terrible things. And tomorrow night, violence is coming through my front door." Nadia didn't flinch. She reached down and took his hand, calloused, strong, surprisingly warm. "You aren't a monster to us. You gave my son breath. You gave him a life. I don't care what you do outside these walls. In here, you're our protector." Adrian gently pulled her hand, drawing her closer until her knees touched the wheels of his chair. "I've spent 20 years being half a man, pitied or feared only because of the guns I employ. But when I look at you, I want to be a man again. A whole man." And he reached up, pulling her down to him. The kiss was desperate, bruising, tasting of rain and whiskey, all the unspoken tension of the therapy sessions, and the hovering shadow of death pouring into that single connection. Nadia melted against him, hands gripping his broad shoulders as his arms wrapped around her waist and pulled her onto his lap. For the first time in 20 years, Adrian felt the warmth of a woman across his thighs. And miraculously, agonizingly, he felt the pressure. The nerves screamed, misinterpreting the weight as a dull ache. But he welcomed it. It was feeling. It was life. "Tomorrow night," he murmured against her lips, breath hot. "When the alarms go off, you take Leo and you lock the steel door in the basement. You do not come out until I come for you. Do you understand? Promise me." "I promise," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. The storm carried into the next evening, a torrential downpour that turned the grounds into a sea of mud and shadow. At exactly 2 a.m, the power to the estate was severed. The mansion plunged into darkness, save for strobing flashes of lightning. The backup generators, mysteriously sabotaged, failed to kick in. Down in the basement, behind 3 inches of reinforced steel, Nadia sat on a cot, clutching a sleeping Leo to her chest, the room lit by battery-powered lanterns, her heart pounding as muffled bursts of automatic gunfire filtered down through the floorboards. Vincent had made his move. Up in the grand foyer, it was a war zone. Vincent had disabled the exterior sensors and unlocked the service entrance, letting a 12-man hit squad from Kane's family slip inside. They moved with tactical precision, night vision goggles down, weapons suppressed. Gabriel and the loyal guards met them in the grand hallway, the air thick with the smell of cordite, shattered marble and blood, muzzle flashes lighting up the priceless artwork and shredded silk. And Vincent, wearing a Kevlar vest, gripping a heavy revolver, bypassed the firefight entirely. He knew exactly where Adrian would be. The master bedroom, ground floor, east wing, the crippled king, trapped in his bed or his chair, waiting to be slaughtered. He kicked open the double doors. "Adrian!" he yelled, sweeping his flashlight across the darkness. The bed was empty. The wheelchair sat in the center of the room, empty. "Looking for a promotion?" The voice came from the shadows near the windows. Vincent whipped his gun and his light toward the sound, and there stood Adrian Moretti, not leaning on anything. He wore black tactical trousers and a dark shirt, blending perfectly with the shadows. In his right hand, a massive, custom-machined tactical cane, solid steel, tipped with a tungsten glass breaker. In his left, a pistol. Vincent froze, his brain failing to process it. What is this? You can't stand." "I've been a busy man," Adrian said, his voice a chilling, deadly calm. "It's a trick," Vincent stammered, his hand shaking. He raised the revolver. "You're propped up on wires. You're a dead man, Adrian." He pulled the trigger, but 20 years of upper body strength, built from dragging his own dead weight, propelled Adrian with explosive speed. He pivoted, his newly awakened legs screaming in agony but holding firm. The bullet shattered the window behind him. Before Vincent could cock the hammer again, Adrian lunged forward and swung the solid steel cane like a baseball bat. The metal struck Vincent's gun hand with a sickening crack, shattering his wrist, the revolver clattering to the floor. Vincent screamed, dropping to his knees, and Adrian didn't stop. He stepped forward, his gait heavy and uneven and utterly terrifying, and brought the butt of the pistol across Vincent's jaw, sending the traitor sprawling onto his back, blood spraying across the rug. Adrian planted his boot squarely on Vincent's chest, leaning his weight onto his left leg, groaning internally at the blinding spike of pain, but his face a mask of pure sadistic dominance. "You brought rats into my house," he growled, pointing the pistol between his cousin's eyes. "You threatened a woman under my protection. You threatened a child." Wait, Adrian, please," Vincent begged, spitting blood, staring up in absolute horror at the cousin he'd thought was helpless. "Cain made me do it. He said he'd kill my wife." "You're lying," Adrian said coldly, "and you are no longer family." A single gunshot rang out, instantly swallowed by the crash of thunder outside. Adrian stepped back, chest heaving, legs shaking violently as the adrenaline wore off, and the muscles threatened to give out. He leaned heavily on the cane, dragging in breaths of the gunpowder-scented air. And then the bedroom door burst open. 3 of Cain's hitmen poured in, weapons raised, and they stopped dead. They looked at the body of Vincent Moretti. Then they looked at the legendary paralyzed boss of the syndicate, standing tall, holding a smoking gun and a steel cane. The sheer impossibility of it froze them for a crucial 2-second window. It was all Adrian needed. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the agonizing tear in his thigh, and fired 3 times in rapid, perfect succession. All 3 hitmen dropped, dead before they even understood how the man in the wheelchair had outmaneuvered them. 10 minutes later, the gunfire ceased. Gabriel walked into the master suite, bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, his suit ruined. He surveyed the carnage, then looked at Adrian, who had finally collapsed back into his wheelchair, pale and drenched in sweat. "The house is secure," Gabriel reported, nudging Vincent's body with his shoe. "Cain's men are dead. We lost 2 guards. Clean this up," Adrian breathed, his hands trembling as he laid the gun on his lap. "And send a message to Silas Cain. Tell him I'm sending him a present. Put Vincent in a box and leave it on his front porch." Gabriel nodded, a fierce, proud smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Yes, boss. And Gabriel. Go get Nadia and the boy." Adrian looked down at his legs, a fierce, triumphant light burning in his eyes. "Tell them it's safe to come up." When the heavy steel door of the panic room finally hissed open, the silence of the mansion was more terrifying than the gunfire had been. Nadia carried Leo up the stairs, shielding his face against her shoulder. The men had been brutally efficient with the cleanup, but the mansion bore the scars of a siege. Shattered mirrors, bullet holes chewed through the woodwork, missing sections of antique rug rolled up and carried away, the scent of industrial bleach masking the metallic tang of blood. She found Adrian in the medical wing near the gym, back in his wheelchair, his right pant leg rolled up to expose a thigh wrapped in ice and compression bandages, the lead specialist meticulously checking his vitals. The lethal predator who had executed his own cousin was gone, replaced by a man hollowed out by physical agony and betrayal. "Is Leo all right?" Adrian asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "He's asleep again," Nadia murmured, stepping closer as the doctor gave a grim nod and left them privacy. "You tore a hamstring," she said, her professional eye taking in the swelling. "And you overloaded the lumbar nerves. You pushed yourself months ahead of schedule, Adrian. You could have severed the cord completely this time." "I had to stand," he replied simply, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Vincent came into my room with a loaded weapon. He expected a victim. I gave him a nightmare." Nadia stepped into his space and dropped to her knees in front of the chair, resting her hands gently on his uninjured leg. The realization of what he'd done, what he'd risked to protect her and her son, crashed over her like a wave. She was a physical therapist from a rough neighborhood. He was the undisputed king of the underworld. By every law of nature and society, they should never have collided. And yet, looking at the exhaustion lining his face, she knew there was no going back. "You killed your own family to protect us," she whispered. Adrian reached down, his strong fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "Vincent stopped being family the moment he let men into this house to hurt you. I told you, Nadia. I protect what's mine." 30 miles south, the sun was just rising over the industrial smog. Silas Kane stepped onto the front porch of his heavily guarded compound, holding an espresso, wearing a silk robe, expecting a call from Vincent Moretti confirming the transfer of power. Instead, he found a massive polished oak crate on his front steps. His guards drew their weapons and formed a perimeter, and the head of his security pried the lid off with a crowbar. Inside, resting on a bed of dry ice, was the body of Vincent Moretti. Pinned to his chest was a simple handwritten note on heavy cream Moretti stationery. "The throne is not empty. I'll see you at the commission." Kane crushed the note in his fist, the color draining from his face. "Moretti knows," he hissed. "He knows everything." Panic set in. He'd bet his entire coup on Adrian being a helpless invalid. If Adrian was strong enough to repel a 12-man hit squad and execute his own underboss, the whole story Kane had spun was unraveling. So he grabbed his phone and dialed the private number of the ruthless head of the East Coast families. "Dominic," Kane said, trying to steady his voice. "Moretti's gone mad. He's executing his own blood. We need to call a national summit. Now, before his paranoia tears the whole region apart." Adrian knew the summit was coming. It was the only card Kane had left. He had exactly 3 weeks to prepare for a meeting that would decide whether he lived as a king or died as a martyr. And for 3 weeks, the private gym became a torture chamber. "Push!" Nadia commanded over the sound of heavy breathing and straining metal. "Don't rely on your arms, Adrian. Drive through the heels. Fire the glutes." Adrian roared in frustration, muscles trembling as he forced himself up. He wasn't just standing anymore. He was learning to walk. It was agonizing, clumsy work. Without fine control of his still numb calves and feet, he had to swing his hips and lock his knees, using the raw strength of his thighs to carry his weight. He fell constantly. He bruised his ribs, bloodied his knuckles, screamed into the mats. But every time he fell, Nadia was there. She didn't pity him. She didn't let him quit. She worked the scarred tissue, iced his screaming joints, and pushed him right back to the edge. Their bond, forged in the fires of that brutal rehab, became something unbreakable. Late at night, when the pain was too much for Adrian to sleep, Nadia would lie beside him in the massive bed. They didn't talk about the underworld or Silas Kane. They talked about Leo's future, about the ocean, about a life where Adrian Moretti was just a man, not a myth. "If we survive next week," he whispered one night, his arm wrapped tight around her, her head on his chest, "I'm going to legitimize the family. Port logistics, real estate, unions, no more blood. I want to build an empire Leo can inherit without ever having to wear a Kevlar vest." Nadia looked up at him in the dark. "You'd walk away from all of it?" Adrian kissed her forehead, his lips lingering. "I'd walk through hell." The summit was held on neutral ground, a soundproofed vault beneath a luxury high-rise in the financial district, owned by a shell company untraceable to any single family. The National Commission hadn't gathered in full force in over a decade. The heavy oak table was surrounded by the most dangerous men in the country, smoking cigars and drinking imported scotch, the tension thick enough to choke on. Silas Kane sat near the head, sweating through his custom suit, having spent the last hour pleading his case, painting Adrian as a paranoid, crippled tyrant who'd lost his grip. "He killed his own cousin Dominic," Kane urged. "He's holed up in that fortress with some civilian woman, ignoring the docks, letting the unions run wild. He's a liability. We take him out tonight, I absorb the operations, and I guarantee a 20% increase in your tribute by the end of the fiscal year." Dominic, An older man with a face like carved granite tapped his cigar over an ashtray. Adrian Moretti has paid his tribute on time for 20 years, Silas. He runs a tight ship. Killing a sitting boss requires proof of insanity, not just a rumor of weakness. The proof is coming through that door any minute. Kane sneered. Look at him when they wheel him in. The man is a ghost. Right on cue, the heavy steel doors unsealed with a loud hiss. Gabriel Vance entered first, in a perfectly tailored black suit, his eyes sweeping the room, registering every face, every hidden hand. He stepped to the side, and the room fell dead silent. Because Adrian Moretti did not roll in. He walked in. Slowly, a heavy oak cane gripped in his right hand, his gait stiff and methodical and radiating menace, wearing a three-piece charcoal suit that perfectly framed his imposing physique. Every step echoed like a thunderclap. Silas Kane's jaw literally dropped, the color completely draining from his face. He looked like he'd just seen the devil rise from the floorboards. Adrian reached the head of the table. He did not sit. He stood tall, towering over the seated bosses, his cold eyes locking onto Kane. Dominic, gentlemen, he greeted, his voice smooth, deep, and utterly without fear. Apologies for my delay. I was busy attending to a pest problem. Adrian, Dominic breathed, genuinely stunned. The rumors, they said you were paralyzed for 20 years. I had a bad back, Adrian said, a cruel, razor-sharp smile playing on his lips. It seems to have improved. He tossed a thick manila folder onto the center of the table, where it landed with a heavy smack. Inside that folder, he told the commission, his eyes never leaving Kane, are bank statements, wire transfers, and encrypted phone transcripts. Silas Kane paid my cousin $2 million to sabotage my shipments. He sent a hit squad into my home, endangering my family. He broke the truce. He broke the laws of this commission. Dominic opened the folder, scanning the top documents. The silence was suffocating. Kane began to stammer, shoving his chair back. It's fake! He fabricated it! He's a liar! Silas, Dominic interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous baritone. He closed the folder. He looked at Kane, then up at the towering figure of Adrian Moretti. You told us he was weak. You told us he was helpless. You lied to the commission. The verdict was unspoken but absolute. In their world, lying to the commission to orchestrate a coup was a death sentence. Kane lunged for the door, his hand reaching for a concealed weapon. He never made it. Gabriel moved with blinding speed, drawing and firing a single shot that caught Kane in the back of the knee. The traitor screamed, collapsing onto the tile, his gun skittering into the shadows. The other bosses didn't even flinch. They simply watched as Adrian slowly, methodically walked around the table toward the writhing figure. He stood over his rival, leaning heavily on his cane, the exertion sending fire up his spine, but showing not 1 ounce of weakness. You thought my wheelchair was a prison, Silas, he said quietly. The words meant only for him. But it was a cage, and you were foolish enough to unlock it. And when Adrian Moretti finally took his seat at the head of the table, wiping a speck of blood from his cuff with a silk handkerchief, the hierarchy of the entire underworld had been permanently rewritten. He wasn't just the boss of one city anymore. He was the undisputed king, the man who conquered Paralysis and crushed a rebellion in the same month. Now, he said, looking around at the stunned, silent faces. Let's discuss the future of our logistics operations. 2 years later, the salty breeze of the Mediterranean swept across the private terrace of a sprawling villa on the Amalfi coast. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the ancient stone and lush gardens. Adrian Moretti stood near the balustrade, looking out over the water. The titanium wheelchair was a relic now, locked away in storage back home. He still walked with a slight limp, relying on a sleek, silver-handled cane for long distances. But the transformation was nothing short of a medical miracle. His muscles had filled out, his posture was straight, and the haunted, cynical shadows that once darkened his eyes were completely gone. He had kept his promise. After the bloody summit, he'd systematically purged the violent elements of his empire, cutting loose the street-level rackets and funneling billions into legitimate shipping, high-end real estate, and political lobbying. He was now a titan of industry, untouchable and respected in the highest circles of global commerce. A sudden burst of laughter echoed from the gardens below. Adrian smiled, leaning over the balcony. Down on the manicured lawn, 10-year-old Leo was sprinting across the grass, chasing a golden retriever puppy, his face flushed with health, his chest rising and falling effortlessly. The experimental treatments funded by Adrian's fortune, combined with the pure sea air, had sent Leo's condition into total remission. He was a normal, happy kid. "He's going to exhaust that dog before dinner," a soft voice murmured behind him. Adrian turned. Nadia stepped out onto the terrace in a simple, flowing white sundress that caught the evening breeze, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked radiant, deeply rested, and unimaginably beautiful. And on her left hand, a flawless emerald-cut diamond caught the fading sunlight. Adrian let go of the balustrade and crossed to her without bothering with his cane, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her flush against his chest. "Let him run," he murmured, burying his face in her hair, breathing in jasmine and ocean salt. "He's making up for lost time. We all are." Nadia rested her hands on his broad chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. She looked up into the eyes of the man who had terrified her in that lakeshore mansion 2 years ago. The ruthless boss was still in there. She saw flashes of it when a business rival tried to cross him. But that darkness was fiercely controlled now, entirely devoted to protecting their family. "The doctor called today," she said, smiling. "He wants to publish a paper on your neurological recovery. He's calling it a spontaneous remyelination of the lumbar spine. Says it defies modern medical literature." Adrian chuckled, a deep, rich sound. "Let him write whatever he wants. The doctors didn't fix me, Nadia. You did. You dug your hands into a dead man and dragged him back to life." "I just broke down the scar tissue," Nadia whispered, tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "You had to do the walking." And Adrian leaned down and captured her lips in a slow, searing kiss. A kiss built on absolute trust, forged in the fires of survival, and sealed by a love neither of them had ever expected to find. 20 years in a wheelchair had taught Adrian Moretti patience, strategy, cruelty, and the bitter taste of isolation. But it was the miraculous touch of a desperate single mother that finally taught him how to truly live. He had ruled an underworld from a seated position, and now, holding Nadia tight, standing strong on his own 2 feet, he knew he was finally a king in the light. What an incredible journey of resilience, love, and redemption. Adrian and Nadia's story proves something worth remembering. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't come from a surgeon's scalpel, but from the unshakable dedication of someone who simply refuses to give up on you. So here's my question for you before you go. Do you believe love and sheer willpower can accomplish what even the best doctors can't? Or was this just a 1 in a million miracle? Drop your answer in the comments because I read every single one. If this story of an impossible recovery and a mother's fierce love kept you on the edge of your seat, do me a favor and smash that like button right now. Share it with someone who loves a pulse-pounding romance. And subscribe and tap that bell so you never miss the next incredible story. I'll see you in the next one.